In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And a man who stands in the same spot every morning with the same loaded pistol and does the same thing to a different face. 342 mornings. He never missed one. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is about Commissar Jennek Hult, assigned to a regiment of former textile workers on a frozen trench world called Trevannoch. The two commissars before him didn't last. One was found with his own bolt pistol in his mouth. The other took a round through the back of the skull. The report said enemy fire, and nobody checked the angle. So the commissariat looked at the file and sent the most boring man they had. Not brilliant, not brave, consistent. The kind of man who does the same thing on day 200 that he did on day 1. And he did. Every morning, one man stood in front of him. Every morning, the line held. What nobody was looking at closely enough to notice was what that consistency was costing everyone else. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first man I shot on Trevannoch was a sergeant. That is never where you want to start. He had been in charge of the welcome detail. 4 men sent to collect me from the landing pad, all of them wearing the expression of dogs that have been kicked on a schedule so regular they have started sleeping between the kicks. The sergeant had a las gun slung on a length of wire where the proper strap had rotted through, a coat that had belonged to someone broader, and a mouth that began moving the moment I stepped off the shuttle and did not stop until I put a bolt round through the bridge of his nose approximately 4 minutes later. His name was Dershen. He was the first. He was not, by any measure you care to use, the last. What Sergeant Dershen said to me in those 4 minutes was not treasonous. That would have made it simple. Treason is easy. You hear it, you identify it, you draw your sidearm, and the Imperium moves forward by 1 corpse. What Dershen did was worse than treason and harder to name. He told me to get back on the shuttle, not as a threat. He was not pointing a weapon at me, he was not angry. He put it the way a man tells you the bridge is out 3 kilometers up the road, having watched 6 vehicles go over the edge that week and grown tired of hearing the splash. Commissar, sir, respectfully, the shuttle holds 1 and has fuel for the return trip, and the pilot will not report you because the pilot does not want to come back here either. He said it in front of his detail. 3 men heard him say it. One of them was nodding. So I shot him, and the nodding stopped, and nobody offered me advice about shuttles after that, and we walked to the regimental position in a silence that does more work than conversation ever has. That was day 1. I will tell you about the other 341. Trevannoch is a world that should not exist, in the sense that whatever decision was made to settle it must have been arrived at by a committee that had never visited and could not be made to. It sits in the Quarnbraith Reach, spinward of nothing useful, on an orbit that gives it 14 months of winter and 6 weeks of what the locals call summer, and the rest of the galaxy would call a brief reduction in hostility from the weather. The planet is industrialized in the way that a broken bone is industrialized. Someone has driven metal into it at angles and called the result functional. There are cities, if you are generous with the word. There are manufactoria. There are 800 million people who have never seen a sky that was not the color of a month-old bruise, and every one of them seemed personally surprised that the Imperium had bothered to defend them, which tells you everything about Trevannoch's relationship with its own government. The war had been going on for 2 years before I arrived. A general insurrection, the briefing packet called it, which is the Munitorum's way of saying that a significant portion of the population had decided that the Emperor's governance was no longer to their liking, and had expressed this opinion with military-grade ordnance. Where they got the ordnance was a question nobody in the briefing packet seemed interested in answering, and I was not being paid to be curious about supply chains. I was being paid to make soldiers out of frightened men, hold them on a line, and shoot the ones who could not. The Culwer Line ran 400 kilometers across the Trevannoch Midlands, east to west, anchored on a river at one end and a mountain that was more slag heap than geology at the other. It was the trench system the Imperium builds when it cannot be bothered with a fortification and cannot afford to say so. Deep enough to stand in, not deep enough to live in. Roofed with sheet metal stolen from the manufactoria behind us and reinforced by the guards' absolute conviction that a hole with men in it is a defensive position. 14 regiments held the Culwer Line, which sounds like a great many men until you divide 400 kilometers by 14 and understand what the word held is doing in that sentence. Nobody held 400 kilometers. 14 regiments held the 14 stretches of ground that could be held. The road crossings, the rail cuttings, the high spoil banks a man could dig into, and between those stretches ran wire, minefields, observation posts, and a great deal of empty country, which on a Munitorum chart is called a continuous defensive position, and on the ground is called a gap. The Culwer 44th held Sector 9, 2.5 kilometers of trench with a slight bend in the middle that the men called the elbow. I lived in it for the better part of a year, and most of the men who lived in it with me are dead. The Culwer 44th were not a bad regiment. I want that on whatever record this reaches. The 44th had been raised on Culwer, a civilized world in the Hespertine subsector that produces textiles and a middling quality las gun power cell, and a population that is, on the whole, better suited to manufacturing than to war. They were not warriors. They were workers who had been given uniforms and told to point the loud end at something, and they had done this with the grim determination of people who have spent their lives being told what to do and have never once been given a reason. I read the intake schedules on my second night, and they told me more than any officer did. Better than half the original intake had come off the mill floors. Spinners, carders, loom tenders. That is a specific sort of man, good at an exact thing at an exact interval for as long as the shift runs, accustomed to being counted at the start of it and counted again at the end, and disinclined to improvise, because on a mill floor, improvising is how you lose an arm. Everything I subsequently did to the 44th worked because of that. A man off a shift does not have to believe in a schedule. It has to be there tomorrow at the same hour, and if it is, he will stand in it. By the time I arrived, the 44th had been on the Culwer Line for 11 months. They had started at regimental strength. They were down to 431 effective soldiers, a colonel who no longer left his dugout, and a detailed list of the dead that nobody had been ordered to stop updating, and so nobody had. Colonel Ludden Parith was the 5th commanding officer the 44th had fielded since arriving on Trevannoch. The first 4 had died in action. That is the polite version. The less polite version is that the first was killed by a mortar round, the second by a sniper, the third by a mortar round in what was either a coincidence or a comment on the enemy's opinion of the 44th's leadership, and the fourth by his own adjutant, who shot him during a bombardment and blamed it on shrapnel and was believed because nobody had the energy to investigate, and because the adjutant was a better officer anyway. The adjutant was then killed 8 days later by a mortar round, because Trevannoch had a sense of humor and expressed it with high explosives, and Colonel Parith was promoted from his position as senior surviving captain, which by that point meant the captain who had been hiding most effectively. Parith was not a coward in the way the Schola Progenium taught me to recognize cowards. He did not shake. He did not weep. He did not attempt to desert or beg or petition for transfer. What Parith did was something more sophisticated. He stopped. He continued to occupy the physical space of a regimental commander. He sat in the dugout. He signed the papers. He read the reports. He issued the orders, and the orders were not even bad, technically. Parith had been a competent captain, and competence does not evaporate just because the man carrying it has decided that none of it matters. But the life had gone out of him the way heat leaves a corpse, from the extremities inward, and by the time I arrived, he was a warm body in a cold chair, doing a job that a servitor could have done with fewer ration requirements and less need for a latrine. The regiment knew it. The men knew it. The enemy, I suspect, knew it. The only person who did not seem to know it was the Munitorum, and the Munitorum knew nothing about anything below the level of a spreadsheet. My predecessors in the commissarial role had fared no better than the colonels. The first commissar assigned to the 44th had lasted 9 weeks. He was found dead in his billet with his own bolt pistol in his mouth. The official finding was accidental discharge during maintenance, which is what the commissariat writes. When it does not want to put the word, it is thinking on a document that other commissars might read. The second had lasted 4 months. He was killed by a las gun round that entered the back of his skull during a trench raid, and the investigation concluded that the round had come from an enemy position, and nobody looked too closely at the angle, and his replacement was me. The commissariat does not explain its assignments. It issues them. But it keeps records the same way the Munitorum keeps records, and a body that has lost 2 officers to the same regiment in less than a year has a file open on that regiment, and the file has a note on it, and the note decides what kind of man gets sent next. My previous posting had been a labor regiment on a compliance world where the discipline was routine, and the executions were infrequent enough that I could not now tell you the number without checking. My assessments used words like consistent and unimaginative and reliable under sustained conditions. Standing on that landing pad with Dershin cooling at my feet, I understood which of those 3 words had put me on Trevannoch. You do not send an inspiring man to a regiment that has eaten 2 commissars. You send a man who will be doing on day 200 exactly what he did on day 1. The 44th's problem had never been morale. It was continuity, and continuity is a thing you can requisition. The crossing took 11 weeks and cost the transport 4% of its cargo, which is what the Navy writes when it means people. I arrived on the 214th day of the Trevannoch campaign year, which the locals measured from the first snowfall, and I shot Sergeant Dershin on the landing pad, and I walked to the 44th's position in Sector 9, and I stood in the trench that would become my home, and I looked at what I had been given. 431 men, most of them from Poliver still, some from other units, replacements fed in through the Munitorum pipeline to plug gaps, men from regiments that had lost their coherence on other parts of the line and been redistributed like spare parts from a wreck. The original Poliver men had a look about them that I had seen before on other worlds, in other regiments, in the faces of men who have been fighting long enough to forget what the fighting is for, but not long enough to stop doing it. The replacements had a different look. They had the eyes of men who had been broken once already, and put back together badly, and sent to a place where nobody knew their names and nobody cared to learn them. The trench was a masterwork of incremental decay. It had been dug properly once by somebody who understood field fortification. After that, it was maintained by people who did not, then by people who did not care, then not at all. The firing step was ankle-deep in standing water that froze at night and thawed by mid-morning into something that smelled like a latrine, because in several places it was a latrine. The dugouts had been shored with timber that was rotting from the bottom up, so that the roofs sagged in the middle like the spines of old men, and the walls wept a constant slick of moisture that got into everything: clothing, food, ammunition, sleep. The wire in front of the position had been cut so many times by enemy patrols and repaired so many times with whatever was to hand that it no longer resembled wire so much as a sculpture of a headache. I spent my first 3 hours walking the length of the sector. 2.5 kilometers of trench, communication trenches branching off like veins, fire bays, weapon pits, dugouts, latrines, the aid station, a hole in the wall with a canvas screen, and a medikey who had run out of antiseptic 6 weeks before I arrived and was treating wounds with boiled cloth and profanity. I counted weapon emplacements. I counted bodies. I counted the things a commissar counts. An officer counts what he has. A commissar counts what he is about to lose. The 44th had enough ammunition for approximately 3 days of sustained combat. It had food for 9. It had no functioning long-range Vox equipment, which meant that anything going south to regimental command and beyond it went by runner, and runners on Trevannoch had a life expectancy that I choose not to calculate. What it did have was the lateral field set, which reached the sector on either side of us, and not 1 meter further. That is how 14 commanders on a 400-kilometer line spoke to each other, and to nobody at all who was in a position to decide anything. It had one heavy bolter where the establishment says 3, and the one it had jammed every 36 rounds and required a kick to the receiver assembly to clear, which its crew administered with the casual expertise of men who have been kicking the same machine for months. The engineer who should have been correcting that fault had been detached at the divisional depot when the regiment moved up to the line, along with his tools and his rights and his authority, to open the receiver housing, and had never been sent forward. I submitted the requisition twice in my first month. Both times the response stated that Mechanicus personnel are allocated against projected service life, and I did not need the second response to understand the first. It had Colonel Parith in his dugout, 6 lieutenants of whom 2 were functional and 4 were alive, a medikey named Stanfell, who was the angriest person I have ever met in a career that has exposed me to a great deal of anger. He was younger than most of the men he treated, not unusual for a medikey and not something he ever mentioned, and he wore a ring on his left hand that he turned with his thumb when he was thinking, which was always, and 430 men who were waiting for something to change and had been waiting so long they had forgotten that change was a thing that could happen. 3 days of ammunition and 9 of food is not a supply position. It is a countdown. On my second morning, I wrote a materiel return in the format the Munitorum requires, establishment against holding, every line on the form filled in, and sent it south with a runner who lived. 13 days later, a convoy came up the reserve road carrying 4 days of ammunition and 6 of rations, not enough, and 13 days after that, another one came. That became the rhythm, and it never changed. Never a surplus, never quite the countdown running out, a chain that arrived on the 13th day when it had been needed on the 9th. I took the credit. My predecessors had written despairing returns, and I had written a correct one, and I concluded that the Munitorum had responded to competence, and I was pleased with myself in a small way I would not have admitted to out loud. The boots came in the 14th week. 200 pairs of cold-weather boots, cut for a world that was not this one, and lined for a world that was, out of a depot that had not answered a requisition from Sector 9 in 11 months. Men who had been losing toes stopped losing toes. I did not ask what had changed the depot's mind. I had an answer I had supplied myself. It was satisfactory, and the list of things requiring my attention was not short. I ate the ration. A commissar may draw against the officer's scale, and I did not. A regiment can be told the ration is adequate, and it will not believe it, but it can be told. Being told it by a man visibly eating something else is being told the opposite by the one mouth in the sector supposed to be immune to the subject. So I ate what they ate, at the hour they ate it, where it could be seen. It was not enough for them, and it was not enough for me. Nobody expected me to carry an ammunition crate up the communication trench afterwards, and I have never pretended the two hungers were the same. The enemy held the ground 300 meters to our north. They had been the Trevannoch's 7th Provincial Infantry once. Now they were something else. The insurrection had taken them the way a disease takes a body. Not all at once, not with a single dramatic collapse, but organ by organ, system by system, until what was left wore the shape of a regiment and moved with the memory of military discipline, but served something that had nothing to do with the Golden Throne. They were well supplied because they held the industrial districts behind their lines and could manufacture what they needed. They were well fed because they had the farms and we did not. They were not going anywhere because they did not need to. They had time and logistics and the weather on their side, and all they had to do was sit 300 meters away and wait for us to finish the job of killing ourselves. I did not intend to oblige them. The first morning I woke at the 4th hour before dawn. This is something I learned at the Schola and have never stopped doing, because a commissar who sleeps past the men he commands is a commissar who has already lost the first argument of the day. I washed my face with water so cold it felt like a slap delivered by the planet itself. I put on my coat. I checked my bolt pistol, 1 round chambered, magazine full, action clean. I stepped out of the dugout that had belonged to the commissar before me and still smelled faintly of what the commissar before me had done with his sidearm, and I walked to the center of the 44th's position, where the trench widened slightly into something that might have been a parade ground if you were feeling charitable, and was certainly a patch of mud if you were not. The men were already there, not because I had ordered them, but because Dershin had been known, and word of how he had stopped being known had reached every dugout in the sector before I had finished my first meal. They stood in the mud and the dark and the cold, and they looked at me and I looked at them, and I said the thing I had planned to say, which I had composed during the walk from the landing pad, and refined during the night, and polished until it was hard and cold and smooth as a round in the chamber. I said, I am Commissar Jennek Hult, and I have been assigned to the Culwer 44th, and I will be here until this war ends, or I do, and every morning I will stand in this spot, and every morning one of you will stand in front of me, and the one who stands in front of me will be the man who most thoroughly failed the Emperor's trust the previous day, and I will shoot him, and we will begin the day clean. Nobody spoke. I had not expected them to. Speaking back to a commissar who has just defined the terms of your survival is a decision that 400 men will think about and none will make. The first man to open his mouth is the first man to have failed the Emperor's trust, and the lesson of Sergeant Dershin was still wet on the landing pad. I let the silence do its work. Silence, properly managed, is the most efficient tool a commissar has. A speech tells men what to think. Silence tells men what will happen if they do not. Then I picked the man. There is always a man to pick on the first morning. I had walked the trench. I had counted the things I count. I had seen the flask. It had been under a blanket in a dugout on the eastern end of the sector, and the man sitting next to it had the particular stillness of someone who has been drinking long enough to forget he is supposed to hide it. and not long enough to stop caring whether he is caught. Alcohol in a combat position is not a character flaw. It is a material failure. A drunk man on a firing step is a gap in the line, and a gap in the line is an invitation to the enemy. And the enemy on Trevannoch did not need invitations. He needed to go, and he went, and his name was Trooper Olander, and I did not know it until after I had pulled the trigger. A commissar does not need to know a man's name to know that the man cannot be permitted to continue being a soldier. 2 men in 2 days. The mud in front of the assembly point had taken the shape of where men stand, and it kept that shape for the rest of the winter, because nobody was willing to walk across it. This is what it takes. You do not hold a line with courage or loyalty or any of the words the Ministorum stitches onto banners. You hold it with routine. Every day begins the same way and ends the same way. The structure does not bend, and the only variable is whether you are standing next to the man with the bolt pistol or in front of him. That is what a commissar is. Not a judge, not an executioner. A fixed point in a universe trying to shake everything loose. The assembly was never the regiment. 400 men cannot form up in a fire trench 2 meters across, and a sector that empties its firing line at a fixed hour every morning is a sector that will be overrun on the first morning somebody troubles to learn the hour. It ran by rotation, a section at a time, so that a given man stood in front of me, perhaps one morning in 4, and spent the other 3 on the step with his weapon, listening to it. That is not the lesser arrangement. A man who hears the shot and does not see it supplies the rest of it himself, and what he supplies is worse than anything I could have arranged for him. It happened at Stand 2, which cost the sector nothing, because the whole line is awake and under arms in the hour before dawn, regardless of what I am doing with a bolt pistol. Dawn is when attacks come. Every trench on every world the Imperium holds stands to at dawn, and every man standing in one of them has already had the worst thought he is going to have that day before the light arrives. I did not create the hour. I used the one that was there. They shelled it once. On day 39, 4 mortar rounds walked across the assembly ground while I had a section formed up on it, and I lost 7 men and the corporal I had been intending to shoot, which saved me a round and cost me the point I had been intending to make with it. I held the assembly the following morning at the same hour on the same ground with the crater still in it. And that is the morning the 44th remembered afterwards, rather than any of the ones with a man standing in front of me. They never walked mortars across that ground again. At the time, I put it down to the difficulty of ranging the same 40 meters twice. By the end of my first week, I had shot 5 men. 1 for drinking, 1 for sleeping on watch, 1 for striking a superior, 1 for what the regulations call self-inflicted injury and what everyone in the trench called exactly what it was, and 1 for desertion, which on the Culwer Line meant walking south, because north was the enemy, and east and west were other regiments' sectors, and south was the only direction that did not have a war in it. The deserter had made it 200 meters. He had not run. He had simply walked at a normal pace in his full kit, as if he had been ordered to go somewhere and was following the order. A sentry had challenged him. He had not responded. He had not sped up. He had kept walking, and the sentry had not fired because firing at a man's back felt wrong even when the man was leaving, and the sentry was a human being before he was a soldier, and human beings hesitate. I do not. That is the other thing a commissar is. The part that does not hesitate, installed in the mechanism like a firing pin, or the mechanism jams. 5 men in 7 days, and the trench was cleaner. The water was being drained. The firing step was being maintained. The wire was being repaired. The heavy bolter was still jamming every 36 rounds, but the crew had found an additional 4 crates of ammunition in a collapsed dugout that nobody had bothered to excavate. Nobody had bothered to do anything until there was a reason, and I was the reason. I did not inspire them. I did not motivate them. I frightened them, and frightened men dig faster than motivated men, and fear does not require resupply. 2 of them came for me in the first month. The man before me had taken a lasgun round through the back of the skull during a trench raid, and the file said enemy position, and the angle said otherwise, so I had been expecting it. The first was on my 11th night in the communication trench with an entrenching tool from behind. Good moment, wrong tool. The second came 9 days later, better planned, and failed anyway. Both stood in front of me the following morning. The regiment twice watched a man executed for trying to stop the executions. I said the rest of it out loud once. A commissar who dies of enemy action gets replaced. A commissar who dies of something the file cannot dress as enemy action does not get an investigator, because an investigation costs a man and produces a document. He gets a figure. The figure comes off the regiment, and it is not small, and it is not arrived at by evidence. I told them that at the 4th hour before dawn, shot the morning's man, and went and ate. Nobody came for me again. Colonel Parith watched all of this from his dugout. He signed the execution orders after the fact. The regulation requires a commanding officer's endorsement, even when the commanding officer's endorsement is a rubber stamp wielded by a man who has stopped being anything but a signature. He did not object. He did not approve. He existed in the narrow space between those two things, which is where Ludden Parith had been living for months, and I decided on my 7th day that he was not a problem I needed to solve immediately. A colonel who does nothing is better than a colonel who does the wrong thing, and Parith's nothing was, in its way, the most stable element of the 44th's structure. The men did not hate him. They did not love him. They had stopped thinking about him, the way you stop thinking about a wall. He was there. He would continue to be there. That was the entirety of his contribution, and for the moment it was enough. The enemy probed our sector on my 8th day. A night raid, 20 men, well coordinated, coming through a gap in the wire that had been cut the previous evening, and not repaired because the repair detail had been pulled to shore up a collapsing section of communication trench. They came in fast and quiet and professional. They killed 3 of ours before the alarm went up, and we killed 9 of theirs before the rest withdrew. In the morning, I shot the man responsible for the wire repair schedule. The wire had not been repaired, and 3 men were dead for it. That was the 8th. The mornings are the spine of this. Without them, a regiment on the Culwer Line is not a regiment. It is a decomposition. The first month took 63 men. Of those, I shot 9. The enemy killed 38 in raids, bombardments, and 1 full-scale assault that hit the western end of our sector at dawn on the 22nd day. 19 dead in the assault itself, 11 wounded, of whom 4 died later in the aid station. Mediki Stanfell could not do surgery without surgical tools. He described what he was doing instead with a specificity that suggested he wanted me to hear every word. Mechanical approximation of procedures designed to be performed in conditions that bear no resemblance to these conditions. Commissar, sir, and if you would like to file a complaint about the quality of my work, I invite you to file it with the depot that has not sent me a resupply since the 3rd month of this campaign. Stanfell was the angriest man in the regiment, and he directed that anger at everything within reach like a flamer on a slow traverse. He had enough of it to run a manufactorum. He was also the only man in the 44th who spoke to me the way he spoke to everyone else, which is to say badly, and I never once considered shooting him for it. A commissar who shoots his own medici has decided that discipline is more important than surgery, and I have many flaws, but that particular species of idiocy is not among them. Somebody tested it. In my 6th week, a corporal said something to me in front of his section that was, word for word, milder than anything Stanfell said to me over breakfast. I walked him to the parapet and then said it to the whole fire bay. Stanfell is not exempt from the regulation. Stanfell is exempt from me because I require his hands and have no requirement regarding his manners. The corporal had hands too. His hands loaded a loss gun, and so did 400 other pairs. I did not shoot him. The boundary stopped moving that afternoon. The rest of the 63, 7 froze. This is the thing about Trevannoch that the briefing packet failed to mention, probably because the people who wrote the briefing packet had never stood in an open trench on a world where the temperature drops so far below freezing that the concept of freezing becomes academic. Men died in their sleep. They went to their billets exhausted, wrapped themselves in whatever they had, and in the morning they were furniture. The cold did not care about morale or discipline or the emperor's will. It killed evenly, without prejudice, and the only defense against it was to keep moving, keep working, keep the blood circulating, which meant that the men who survived were the men who never stopped, and the men who died were the men who paused. 2 more were killed in accidents involving the trench itself, a wall collapse and a misfire from the heavy bolter that took a loader's head off when the jam clearance went wrong. 4 deserted. I caught 2. The other 2 made it to the enemy lines, or they died in the open ground between, and I never found out which because there was never time to look, and a man who has left is a solved problem, regardless of the solution. 63 men in 30 days. The morning executions accounted for 9. The rest was the war. What I did every dawn was not the killing. The killing was everything else. The war kills, the cold kills, the mud kills, disease kills, and poor supply kills, and bad decisions made in warm rooms by men who will never set foot in a trench kill more than all the rest combined. What I did every morning was not the killing. It was the sound the killing makes when someone is paying attention. The Munitorum sent the first batch of replacements on day 34. 60 men. I stood on the communication trench and watched them come in, and my first thought was that someone in the logistics chain had made a clerical error and sent me a hospital ward instead of a fighting unit. They were not Poliver men. They were not anything, really. They were scraps. 14 from the Ilsmore 91st, which had ceased to exist as a formation on the eastern end of the line 3 weeks prior. 9 from a penal detail that had been reclassified as regular infantry because someone in the administration had decided that punishment was less important than filling a hole on a chart, and the rest from a holding depot that functioned, as far as I could determine, as a place where the Munitorum stored human beings it could not immediately find a use for, the way you store ammunition that is past its certification but not yet worth the paperwork to condemn. They were, to be fair, alive. That was their primary qualification. Some of them could hold a lasgun without the lasgun pointing at something it should not point at, which put them in the upper half of the intake. I had Sergeant Gosgrin sort them. He had been a corporal when I arrived and was a sergeant by day 15, the sergeant above him having died in the night raid, and Gosgrin being the kind of man who steps into a gap without being told to. He was from Poliver and 30, which made him old for the 44th. He had decided that since he could not control whether he lived, he would control everything else, and he controlled it well. He had been a shift foreman in a weaving hall in Poliver's northern manufactory district, which accounts for the sorting and the rotas and the fact that he never once needed a task written down for him. He could not read. I worked that out in my third week from the way he handled any document I put in his hands, which was to ask me what I wanted done with it, and I never raised it with him. A weaving hall runs on tally marks and memory, and he had a working life of both. It cost the regiment nothing. Gosgrin sorted the replacements in 4 hours. The ones who could shoot went to the fire bays. The ones who could dig went to the repair details. The ones who could carry went to the supply runs. The ones who could do none of these things went to the sections that needed bodies. A warm body on a firing step is better than an empty space, even if the warm body is holding its weapon backwards. And I am not exaggerating. One of the penal transfers held his last gun inverted for his entire first day until a corporal noticed and corrected him, and the man looked at the corporal the way you look at someone who has just told you which end of a fork to use and expects you to be grateful. The replacements died at a higher rate than the originals. This is not a surprise. They did not know the trench. They did not know where the enemy snipers had their lines of sight. They did not know which sections of the parapet had been weakened by bombardment and would collapse if you leaned on them too hard. They did not know the sound of the enemy's mortar, which was different from the sound of our own mortar, and the difference between those two sounds was, on any given day, the difference between ducking and dying. The originals had learned these things through the oldest educational method available to our species, which is to watch the man beside you get it wrong, and the replacements had not had time to accumulate enough examples of other people's mistakes to construct a functional survival instinct. They died, and I replaced them, and the Munitorum replaced them, and the cycle continued. This was not a tragedy. This was logistics. By day 60, I had received 2 more batches of replacements, 41 men in the second, 37 in the third. The 44th's nominal strength was 600. I had never, at any point, had more than 450. The replacements came in and the casualties went out, and the difference between those two numbers was the gap that I lived in, that Gosgrin lived in, that Stanfell lived in, that every man in the trench lived in, the space between what the Munitorum said we were and what we were. The mornings continued. I shot a man who had stolen rations from a dead soldier's pack before the body had been processed. I shot a man who had refused a direct order to advance to a forward observation point because the last 3 men sent to that point had not come back. I shot a man who had fallen asleep during a bombardment, which sounds like a contradiction until you have met exhaustion at the level these men carried it. I shot a man who had struck Medici Stanfell during treatment and broken his hand, and a Medici who cannot work is a gap in the line of a different kind. I shot a man who had done nothing wrong at all on a morning when nobody had, because the morning requires a man. I picked the one closest to doing something wrong, a trooper seen talking to himself at the wire at 3 in the morning, which is not an infraction, but is the road to one. I told myself I was saving him from what he was becoming. I did not believe it, and I did it anyway, and the line held. Something changed after that. Not loudly, not in the way that the stories describe, where the regiment mutters and the commissar feels the ground shift. The morning assemblies had always been quiet. The quality of the quiet was different now. Before, men stood at ease, a posture that says, I have done nothing wrong. After the trooper who talked to himself, they stood rigid, hands at their sides, eyes forward, spines locked. The equation had been simple: do not fail the Emperor's trust, and you will not stand in front of me. Now it had a variable in it they could not control, and the variable was me. Gosgren stopped meeting my eyes in the mornings, not out of fear, out of something I did not have a name for, and I did not ask, and he did not offer, and the space between us where a name would have gone filled up with a silence heavier than the thing it replaced. Stanfell came to my dugout that evening. He stood in the entrance and looked at me for 3 seconds, and then turned and walked away without speaking. This was the loudest thing Stanfell had ever said to anyone. I heard it clearly. None of it arrived as a crisis. There is mourning, and there is a man, and there is the line, and the line must hold, and that is the entire content of the thought. Lieutenant Carnhall was the first officer I came to respect on Trevannoch. She held the eastern section of our sector, the part closest to the elbow, and she held it the way a machine holds a setting, without flair, without brilliance, without any of the qualities that the Schola Progenium tells you to look for in a leader, but with an absolute refusal to stop working that I recognized because it was the same refusal I carried, pointed in a different direction. Carnhall did not like me. She did not dislike me. She regarded me with the flat, professional assessment of a woman who has calculated exactly how useful I am and exactly how dangerous I am, and has decided that the two numbers are close enough to make tolerance the efficient option. She was 26. She was the oldest surviving officer in the 44th, below the rank of colonel, which tells you less about her age than about the life expectancy of officers in Sector 9. She had a scar that ran from her left ear to the corner of her mouth, from a piece of shrapnel that had taken that route during the third assault, and had left her with a face that looked like it was permanently considering whether to smile, and she used that face to deliver orders with a calm that I found, in the circumstances, almost offensive. Nothing rattled Carnhall. I tried once early on the way a commissar tries. I questioned her deployment of a fire team during a raid, and she looked at me with that half-smile and said, "Commissar, you are welcome to stand where they were standing, and I will move them where you suggest, and we will see which arrangement produces more corpses." I did not take her up on it. I am not an idiot. I know the difference between a challenge and an invitation to learn something I already know. The enemy attacked Sector 9 in earnest on Day 71. Not a probe, not a raid. A full infantry assault, 3 waves, preceded by a mortar barrage that lasted 90 minutes and turned the western third of our trench into a canal. They came at dawn, which was their habit, and they came in numbers that I estimated at between 600 and 800 against our 390, and they came with a discipline that made me revise, permanently, my assessment of what the word insurrectionist meant on this world. These were not rabble. They had been soldiers before they had been anything else, and whatever had turned them had not taken their training. They moved in squads. They covered each other's advances. They used smoke. They suppressed our heavy bolter with concentrated lasgun fire from 3 positions at once, a tactic you learn in a lecture hall and not in a street fight, and which told me that whoever was commanding the force opposite us had attended a lecture hall at some point in his career and had paid attention. They hit the western section first, where the bombardment had done its work, and they got into the trench, and what followed was 45 minutes of fighting that has no name because the people who experience it do not have the vocabulary to describe it, and the people who have the vocabulary have never experienced it. Trench fighting is a room full of strangers trying to kill each other with whatever they can reach, and what they can reach is 2 meters wide. It is done with bayonets and entrenching tools and rifle butts and teeth. And once, a cooking pot swung hard enough to collapse the side of a man's head. I shot 4 of the enemy in that 45 minutes and remember none of their faces. Faces are the first thing to go when the fighting is close enough to smell the other man's breath. What replaces them is movement, and you shoot the movement coming toward you. We held. The cost was 57 dead and 31 wounded, of whom Stanfell saved 14 and lost 17, And the look on his face when he told me the numbers was the look of a man who is adding figures to a ledger that he knows will never balance. The enemy left 93 bodies in our trench. That morning, I stood in front of a formation shorter by the width of a platoon and shot a private who had dropped his weapon during the assault and picked up a dead man's entrenching tool. A soldier who abandons his weapon has abandoned the thing that makes him a soldier. The distinction holds even when the entrenching tool worked better. That was the day I understood what the Culwer Line was. It was not a defensive position. It was a mechanism. The enemy fed men into the northern face of it, and we fed men into the southern face, and it ground them up, and the corpses were cleared, and more men were fed in, and the line did not move. It had not moved in 11 months. It was not designed to move. It was designed to hold the way a vice holds, and the thing in the middle was us. Somewhere a man had decided that was an acceptable rate of exchange, and had written it on a form and moved on to the next item. A commissar who resents the machine is a commissar who has misunderstood his own function. I am a component. I am the part that makes the other parts move when they want to stop, and I do this by removing the parts that have stopped, and the machine continues, and the line holds, and somewhere a clerk writes down a number, and the number is correct. The autumn of Trevannoch is indistinguishable from winter except by calendar, and the calendar said autumn, and the cold said otherwise, and the cold on Trevannoch was always right. Sergeant Ghostgren came to me on day 80 with a piece of intelligence that I initially dismissed and subsequently wished I had not. He had been running a patrol in the communication trench, the long one that connected our sector to the reserve line 300 meters south, and he had found something that did not belong there. A set of marks on the trench wall, at regular intervals, scratched into the wooden shoring with something sharp. They were not random. They were symbols, a circle, a line through it, a second circle below. He had seen the same marks on the enemy's equipment during the assault on day 71. 2 of the dead men in our trench had worn them scratched into their armor on the inside, where you would not see them unless you stripped the body. I told him it was probably unit markings. I told him the enemy had been regular military before they turned, and regular military marks its equipment. I told him this because it was the easiest thing to say, and because the alternative was to admit that the enemy was marking our trench from the inside, and had been inside it before the assault, and had people who could get in and out of our position undetected. And that was a problem I did not have time for on top of every other problem I was carrying. Ghostgren looked at me the way a man looks at a wall that has just informed him it is a door. He said, "Yes, Commissar," and left. I noticed that he had a knife on his belt that he had not been carrying the previous week. I noticed that he slept with his back to the wall from that night forward. I noticed that I was noticing, and I put the marks on the list of things I would address when I had addressed everything above them on the list. The list never got shorter. The marks never got addressed, and Ghostgren never brought them up again, having learned in that single exchange that bringing things to the Commissar was a way of having them officially not exist. He also had no second way of raising it. A written report walks past the man who does not want to hear it and lands on somebody else's desk, and that route had been closed to him since before he ever came up the trench. Everything the 44th ever found out about what was happening inside its own wire reached me through a man who could only say it out loud, once, to whoever happened to be standing there. I was who was standing there. Day 100. I had shot 31 men. 31 is a count, and a smaller one than the enemy took, or the cold, or the supply situation, which was not a situation so much as a prolonged institutional failure, wearing the uniform of a logistics chain. What it was the number required. The 44th had held Sector 9 for 100 days without losing a meter of trench, and somewhere a clerk wrote that down, and the system drew a conclusion. What I did know by day 100 was the enemy. I knew them the way you know a neighbor you have never spoken to, but whose habits you have memorized through the wall. The time they wake, the time they eat, the sounds they make when they are comfortable, and the different sounds they make when they are not. The renegade forces holding the line north of us operated on a cycle, bombardment at irregular intervals, never less than every 3 days, never more than every 8. Probing attacks twice a week, usually at night, usually from the east, usually 5 to 15 men testing a section of wire and withdrawing at the first sign of organized resistance. Full assaults once a month, sometimes twice, always at dawn, always with sufficient force to make the outcome uncertain for the first 20 minutes, and never with sufficient force to make the outcome uncertain for the second 20 minutes. They were good enough to hurt us and not good enough to break us, and for a long time I assumed that this was a limitation of their capability, that they were doing the best they could with what they had, and that the Culwer Line held because we were better. The replacements told a story if you knew how to read them. The first 3 batches had been what I expected. Fragments of broken units, penal transfers, depot sweepings. The 4th batch, which arrived on day 106, was different. 43 men from the Nembrist 12th, a functioning regiment from the western sector, which had, according to the transfer documentation, voluntarily released them as surplus to operational requirements. I read that sentence 3 times. I had not encountered the concept of surplus soldiers on Trevannoch. Every sector on the Culwer Line was under strength. Every commander I had spoken to on the lateral set, at the weekly conference that ran when the Fieldvox held and was cancelled when it did not, had complained about manpower. The idea that a regiment had men to spare was like the idea of a desert with water to spare. Technically possible, conceptually offensive. I had Goskrin sort them, because Goskrin sorted everyone. And Goskrin came to me afterwards and said something that I initially took as a joke, and then realized was not. He said, "These are good soldiers." He said it the way you would say there is a 5-course meal in the latrine. With confusion, with suspicion, with the particular disbelief of a man who has been handed something better than what he expected and is certain that something is therefore wrong. They were good soldiers. They could shoot. They knew their drills. They maintained their weapons without being threatened. They dug without being ordered. They did the things that soldiers are supposed to do, and they did them competently. And this was so unusual in the context of Sector 9 that it felt like a clerical error. I assigned them across the line, spreading competence the way Stanfell spread antiseptic when he had it, which was thinly and strategically, and the sector improved. The patrols ran better. The wire was maintained. The response time to enemy probes dropped from minutes to seconds. The new men knew what a probe sounded like and did not need to have it explained to them while it was happening. The Munitorum was now sending me its best men. The Mechanicus still had not sent me an engineer. The 2 bodies do not read each other's files, and have never been asked to. Nobody left Sector 9 wounded. Convoys came up the reserve road loaded and went back empty, and an empty vehicle will carry a man. A casualty who will return to duty is evacuated for treatment, and the Munitorum keeps a form for it. A casualty who will not return to duty is not evacuated. He is transported, and transporting personnel who will not return to duty needs an authorization I never held, countersigned by an officer who had stopped signing things, so they stayed. The sector carried a standing population of men who could not fight and could not go, hands that would not close, a man whose ribs had knitted wrong, who could walk and could not run, two who had lost enough of one foot to be finished on a firing step. They drew the ration and went on the roll as effective, because the form asks how many men are present and not what any of them can do. A strength return in a sector with no working long-range Vox is a sheet of paper in a man's coat, 300 meters of communication trench, then the reserve road, which has observed stretches on it that the enemy ranged in during the first year and never troubled to range again. I ran the runner rota myself. It was the only duty in Sector 9 I would not hand to anybody, and I did not keep it out of conscience. I kept it because a rota somebody else runs acquires favorites, and a rota with favorites in it produces a runner who knows he was chosen for a reason, and a man who knows that walks differently, and a man who walks differently on the reserve road arrives dead. I selected from the men who had come off the line carrying something that had not yet killed them. A healed wound, a burst eardrum, a hand that could carry and could not aim. 16 of them did not come back over the course of the year. 16 is a small figure set against everything else that year cost, and I have given it a sentence of its own because every one of them was carrying my handwriting when it happened, and because the Munitorum requires a strength return weekly, and I chose to send one daily. A weekly return is a number. A daily return is a curve. Somebody in a warm room a long way south looked at my curve, and that is the entire reason for everything that comes after this. I filed my daily strength report. 387 effective. Ammunition adequate. Morale maintained. Position held. The form did not have a box for how or at what cost or for how much longer, and the Munitorum had never thought to add one, and I had never thought to ask. The 5th batch arrived on day 119. 51 men from the Burenthal 78th, another functional regiment, another voluntary release of surplus personnel. Again, good soldiers. Again, competent. Again, the feeling of being handed something that did not match the wrapping. I went to see Colonel Pereth. He was in his dugout, where he always was, behind a table that was a plank of wood on 2 ammunition crates, reading a report that he may or may not have been reading the last time I visited and the time before that. The dugout smelled of damp and lamp oil, and the particular staleness that accumulates around a man who has stopped engaging with the world while continuing to metabolize inside it. I sat on the second crate, my chair, and said, "Colonel, why are we receiving good replacements?" Pareth looked at me. It was the most direct look he had given me since my arrival, and I remember being struck by the fact that his eyes were not dead. They were tired. They were old, far older than his face, but they were working. There was a man behind them still, and the man had heard my question and was deciding whether to answer it. He said, "Because you are holding the line, Commissar." "Every sector is holding the line," I told him. "That is what lines do. They hold or they break, and when they break, the people holding them are dead and do not file reports about it. Not every sector is holding it the way I was holding it." He picked up a sheet of paper from the stack. It was the 44th's own assessment, returned to him with the last replacement allocation. The document that explains to a commanding officer why he is being given what he is being given. A colonel does not receive the figures for the rest of the line. He receives his own, printed beside the line average, which is how the Munitorum tells a man he is performing, and it is enough. Days held per casualty sustained. Combat actions per unit cycle. Replacement utilization rate, which is a term I had never encountered, and which means, as far as I could determine, the number of days a replacement soldier survives in a given sector before becoming a casualty. Our number was the highest on the line, not by a small margin, by a factor that made the other sectors look like they were feeding men into a furnace and we were feeding them into a machine. The 44th, under my management, was producing more days of defensive capability per soldier received than any other formation on the Culwer Line, and the Munitorum had noticed. The Munitorum notices numbers the way a predator notices movement, reflexively and without anything that resembles understanding. So they were sending me the good ones, not as a reward. A good soldier in a well-managed sector produces more combat days than a good soldier in a badly managed one. And the Munitorum had run that calculation the way you put premium fuel in the engine that runs cleanest, and with the same amount of concern for the fuel's opinion. And it was never only men. Sitting on that ammunition crate with Parath sheet in my hand, I understood the boots and the convoys that came on the 13th day instead of never, and the correct return I had been so quietly satisfied with. Sector 9 was the entry that made the chart look survivable, and you do not allow the entry that makes the chart look survivable to run out of ammunition. Somewhere else on the Culwer Line was a sector that had gone to 18 days between convoys so that mine could have 13, and its commissar had written a correct return as well, and nobody had read his. I sat with that information for a while. I sat with it the way you sit with a wound, examining it, determining the extent of the damage, deciding what can be saved. Here is what the numbers meant when you chase them to their conclusion. The Munitorum was routing its best available replacements to my sector because my sector used them most efficiently. This produced better results, which made my sector's numbers better, which made the Munitorum route more of its best replacements to me, which produced better results. A loop, a closed circuit, a system that fed on its own output. Sector 9 held while the sectors stripped to supply. It weakened and bent and sometimes broke. And when they broke, the survivors were redistributed, and some came to me because mine was the sector that could use them. I was not holding the line. I was consuming the line. Every good soldier sent to me was a good soldier, not sent to Sector 7 or Sector 12 or any of the other stretches of trench where men were dying faster because they were being sent worse men because the best men were being sent to me. I was a siphon. I drew the best from every other part of the line and converted it into days held and strength reports that made the charts look the way charts are supposed to look. The man who assessed my sector did not assess the adjacent ones. The man who allocated replacements did not ask why the adjacent ones needed more. The system had no eyes for its own shape. It had an output. The output was correct, and correctness was the only standard it applied. I thought about stopping. Not for long, not productively. The thought existed for a few seconds, the way a round exists in a chamber before the trigger is pulled, present, contained, waiting for a decision that had already been made. I could file a different report. I could lower my numbers. I could stop being efficient. I could let men live who should, by regulation, die, and the sector would weaken, and the numbers would fall, and the Munitorum would reroute its good soldiers elsewhere, and the siphon would stop, and the line would break, not the line in general, my line. Sector 9, the 2.5 kilometers of trench that I had held for 119 days, at a cost of 180 men and 33 bolt rounds. It would break. The men I was being sent were the reason it held, and without them it would not, and breaking is not a recoverable condition. A broken line is a dead regiment and an enemy advance and more dead regiments on either side and the whole front peeling back like a wound, and I am not qualified to make that decision, and neither is anyone who has ever told a commissar to be gentle. So I did not stop. I filed my report. 398 effective. Ammunition adequate. Morale maintained. Position held. And the next morning I shot a man who had carved the enemy's symbols into the stock of his last gun, because the symbols Ghostgren had found on the trench wall were spreading, and I should have addressed them weeks ago, and I had not, and this was one of the prices of not. The symbols were a problem I did not want. They were not chaos, not the sigils and mutations the indoctrination primers describe with a loving detail that always made me suspect the men who wrote them. They were something else, a sign of allegiance, maybe. A way of saying I am listening in a direction nobody was supposed to be looking. 3 men in my sector were wearing them by day 120. I shot one in the morning assembly. The other 2 scraped their marks off before the next dawn, and I let them live because the regulation requires a visible infraction, and I follow the regulation. Ghostgren found more. On the shoring, on the duckboards, scratched into the firing step with the tip of a bayonet. Someone was marking our trench the way an animal marks territory, and I did not know what the marks meant, or who was cutting them, or what happened when there were enough of them. It was the first thing on Trevannoch that frightened me. Everything else I could count. I mentioned it to Parith. He nodded. He said, "It is the same on the other sectors." He said, "The Commissar in Sector 12 shot 6 men for it last week, and the marks came back overnight." He said, "Whatever it is not coming from our side." He said this with the weariness of a man who has identified a problem, reported it, been told it is not a priority, and filed the report in the stack of other reports that are not priorities, and the stack is now taller than the table it sits on. I asked what the report had said and what had come back. He told me both. The report described symbols of an unidentified devotional character appearing in imperial positions across at least 4 sectors recurring after removal, associated with desertion. What came back was the same report, with the word devotional underlined and a note stating that the operational classification of the Trevannoch campaign was general insurrection, and that applications for reclassification were to be submitted through Theater Command with supporting evidence. I understood the note. General insurrection is a category that gets guard regiments, a munitorum supply chain, and 14 colonels who file returns. The other categories get something else, and something else arrives carrying its own authority and its own questions. And the first question it asks is, who has been sitting on this and for how long? The Trevannoch file had 2 years and a theater command on it before I ever came down the ramp. Nobody who owns a file that old goes looking for the finding that turns it into a different file. So the marks stayed devotional, and the campaign stayed an insurrection, and the regiments on the Culwer Line stayed exactly where an insurrection puts them. There was a word that would have moved the file, and any commissar may write it. I did not write it. The first people the Inquisition takes an interest in are the ones standing nearest the marks, and by day 120 that was everybody in Sector 9, and the Commissar who had walked them past those marks every morning for 4 months. I could have been right and finished by the same evening. The Sector 12 Commissar had a view on it, I said. Parith said the Sector 12 Commissar was dead. Shot 3 days ago by a sniper while inspecting the marks on his own parapet, which was either a coincidence or a message. And on Trevannoch, by day 120, I had stopped believing in coincidences the way a drowning man stops believing in dry land. Not because dry land does not exist, but because it has become irrelevant to his immediate circumstances. They had made the attempt on me twice. Once on day 61 and once on day 94, both at the same hour, both out of the same enemy fire bay, both while I was standing in the one spot in Sector 9 where I stand every morning of my life at the same time, which is not a demanding problem for a marksman. I did not move the assembly point. A commissar who moves his assembly point has informed 400 men that the assembly point can be moved, and I would rather be shot at than have that conversation. The first round took the man on my left. The second took a bite out of the parapet behind me, and I finished the morning's business with brick dust in my collar. Then it stopped. I put the stopping down to a marksman reassigned or killed, an answer that required nothing further from me. Day 150. The 44th had received, in total, 297 replacement soldiers since my arrival. Of those, 162 were dead. I had shot 44 men in the morning assemblies. The regiment's effective strength was 312, the lowest since my arrival. Replacements had stopped matching losses, and losses were rising because the attacks were getting heavier, not more frequent, heavier. The same cycle, bombardments, probes, assaults. But the assaults were lasting longer and pushing deeper and bringing more men. The last one, on day 143, had penetrated to the second trench line before Carnhall led a counterattack that drove them back. And Carnhall had taken a round through the thigh, doing it, and was now commanding from a stretcher that 2 men carried along the trench, while she issued orders with the focused irritation of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of something important by the inconvenience of having a hole in her leg. I visited her in the aid station. Stanfell was working on someone else, which meant Stanfell was swearing at someone else. It was the sound of the aid station the way a hymn is the sound of a cathedral, constant, rhythmic, and deeply felt. Carnhall was propped against the wall with her leg wrapped in a bandage that was already dark with blood, and her face wearing that permanent half-smile that I had come to understand was not amusement, but rather the settled expression of a woman whose face had been rearranged by shrapnel and had healed in a shape that conveyed an emotion she did not feel. She said the attacks were probing something. I told her that was what attacks did. No, she said. Same section 3 times. Western approach, same gap in the wire, same entry point. They are not testing whether they can get in. They know they can get in. They are testing what we do when they get in. They are measuring us. I did not sleep that night. Put beside the symbols and the replacements and the numbers on Parath's sheet and the dead commissar in Sector 12, it meant somebody was reading the line the way I read it, running the same calculations, and the conclusions were about me. The enemy was not trying to break the line. The enemy was studying it, how it worked, who made it work, what happened when they pushed, and what happened when they stopped. I was the thing that made my sector different from every other sector, and a variable that can be predicted, can be defeated. It was the first time in my career that I felt like the target rather than the weapon. Day 180. I had crossed the halfway mark of the Trevannoch campaign year without noticing, because halfway marks are for people who believe in endings, and I had stopped believing in endings 60 days earlier. The cold had deepened into something that was no longer weather and had become architecture. The air itself had weight. The frost on the parapet was thick enough to scrape, and the water in the trench had frozen solid and stayed frozen, and the men walked on it like a floor, which made the trench easier to move through and harder to survive in, because a man who falls asleep on ice does not wake up, and men were falling asleep on the ice every night because men were exhausted past describing. I had shot 53 men, not one every morning. That was the promise, and the men believed it, which is what mattered more than the arithmetic. Some mornings, the previous day's fighting had been heavy enough that every surviving man had done his duty, and there was nothing to punish. Some mornings I stood in front of the formation and looked at them and said nothing and walked away. And those mornings held the line better than the executions did, because a commissar who could shoot you and chose not to is more frightening than a commissar who always shoots, the way a loaded weapon is more frightening than a discharged one. The rate was closer to 1 in 3. The reputation was 1 in 1. I did not correct the reputation. The replacements had thinned to a trickle. 12 men in the last cycle. The Munitorum's pipeline was drying up, not because the Munitorum had decided to stop sending men, but because the Munitorum had run out of men to send, at least at the quality that the model required. I knew this because the 12 who arrived were not like the Nembrist men or the Berenthal men. They were depot sweepings again, the kind I had received at the beginning. Men with the eyes of people who have seen one thing too many and have not yet decided whether to process it or be processed by it. One of them arrived with a field manual for a vehicle type the Guard had not operated in 30 years. His reassignment paperwork listed him as a driver. The loop was breaking. The siphon had consumed its supply. I had been efficient enough at using good soldiers that the system had fed me all it had. The other sectors were not recovering, because you cannot recover men who have been spent. The part of that thinning that was mine was the part I could calculate and did not want to. The enemy attacked on day 182, harder than before. 300 meters of our front, the entire western half, hit at once by over 1,000 men in a single wave with no preceding bombardment. Whoever was commanding opposite had been saving his mortar stock for something else and had decided surprise was worth more than preparation. He was right. 54 of my people died in the first 8 minutes. We held. Carnhall held the elbow on her stretcher, directing fire with a voice that could have guided ships through fog. Goskren held the western fire bays with a cold precision that I had always thought was my exclusive domain, and which he had apparently been carrying around the entire time, waiting for a moment that deserved it. Stanfell stopped treating wounds and started shooting, which he did with the accuracy of a man who has spent 6 months wanting to kill something and has finally been given permission. Even Parith came out of his dugout. He stood in the communication trench with a las pistol that I am not certain he knew how to fire, and watched the assault the way a man watches his own house burn after he has stopped owning it. And I do not know whether he fired a shot or not, because I was busy, and because a battle compresses time until the intervals between one pull of the trigger and the next are the only measure left. The cost was 54 dead and 22 wounded, and the enemy left 111 bodies in our trench. When it was over, the sun was up and the frost was melting, and I stood in the middle of Sector 9 and looked at what I had. 209 men, down from the 431 I had started with, not counting the hundreds who had come through and gone under. 209 men in a trench designed for 600, holding a line that had been designed for a regiment and was now being held by a reinforced company that was getting less reinforced by the day. I shot a man that morning. I do not remember what he had done. I remember that it was necessary. I remember that the formation was smaller than it had been the day before, and that the gap where the dead had stood was visible, a physical space in the line of men that nobody had moved to fill, because nobody wanted to stand where a dead man had been standing, in case the position itself was unlucky. And soldiers are superstitious in exactly the way that the Commissariat training manual says they are, and the manual is right about that and wrong about almost everything else. Day 200. The number meant nothing to the men and everything to the system. Sector 9 had been held for 200 consecutive days under a single commissar, which was a record on the Culwer Line and one nobody had asked for. The sectors on either side had changed hands twice in the same period. The reason mine held was the reason theirs broke, and the reason theirs broke was me. What 200 days of standing in front of a formation with a loaded pistol does to the man holding it? It does nothing, and that is the worst thing I know about myself. I stood in the mud 61 times by the 200-day mark and felt each time exactly what the training had prepared me to feel. The nothing was not a void or numbness. It was the presence of function. A bolt pistol does not feel recoil. It absorbs recoil. 12 years in the Schola Progenium and 4 at the Commissariat Academy build a man who can end another man and move on to the next item on the morning's schedule. I did not collapse. I did not waver. I woke up. I washed my face. I checked my weapon. I walked to the assembly point. I chose the man. I shot the man. I holstered my weapon. I inspected the line. Every day. For 200 days. And the line held. Parith asked to see me. This was unusual. Parith did not ask to see people. People went to see Parith, and Parith met their presence with the minimum his rank required, and returned to whatever state he occupied between interactions. Parith asking to see me was like the heavy bolter asking to see me, a piece of equipment expressing a preference, which suggested that the equipment had developed a fault. I went to his dugout. He was not sitting behind his table. He was standing, which was the second unusual thing, and he was wearing his full dress uniform, which was the third, and his face had settled into something I had not seen on it before, which was purpose. He said, "Commissar, I need you to file a report stating that this position is untenable. I sat down the way you brace before a blast. The position was not untenable. I had held it for 208 days, and the evidence was standing in the trench." Parith said, "The evidence is 203 men. We started with 431, 712 replacements since your arrival. 203 left. The sectors to our east and west have between them lost enough soldiers to fill a regiment, and the Munitorum keeps sending them to you because you keep producing the numbers that justify it. The line is thinning everywhere except here, and here is thinning too, only slower. When the sectors on either side break for the third time and do not reform, there will be nothing on our flanks. 203 men cannot hold a position with open flanks. You know this. I know this. The only people who do not are the people reading the numbers. I told him he was asking me to lie. He was asking me, he said, to tell the only truth that would get these men off the line before the line killed every one of them. He was right. 12 men in the last cycle, 9 in the one before. A slope that ended at 0, and when 0 arrived, they would die. My report was the only mechanism that could stop it, because the Commissar is the only officer whose assessment is considered untainted by the wish to survive. The position was untenable, and we both knew it, and the report would still be a lie. It was being held. I was holding it. What a position will become is not what the form asks about, and the form asks about now. Parith looked at me. The look lasted long enough that I became aware of the sounds outside the dugout, the distant thump of a mortar, the closer crack of last gunfire from a patrol engagement, the constant low murmur of men existing in close proximity to other men and to death. He asked whether I understood that I was going to die here. I said yes. Whether I understood that every man in the trench was going to die here. I said yes. And that did not change the report. If I filed a false one and the position came out and the flanks went and the Culwer Line broke, more men die than 203. 203 men dying on a held position is a cost. 203 surviving on an abandoned one is a catastrophe. Parith sat down. He put his hands on the table, and he looked at them, and I realized that his hands were shaking, and that they had been shaking for some time, possibly for weeks, and that the reason he sat behind the table all day was that the table hid his hands, and the reason he did not come out was that outside there was no table. He said, "I have been the commanding officer of 506 men who have died in this sector. That is the number. I keep it. 506, and I signed the papers for every one of them, including the ones you shot, and the ones the cold took, and the ones the enemy killed, and the ones who shot themselves, and the ones who simply stopped and fell down and did not get up, and every one of them is a name on a list that I carry in this pocket." He tapped his chest, not the pocket of his coat, the pocket of his uniform tunic underneath, against his skin. He said, "I am asking you, not ordering. I cannot order you to do this. I am asking you, as one man to another, to write a word on a piece of paper that will save what is left of a regiment that I was given and have failed." I said no. Pareth said nothing. He looked at his hands. I got up and left the dugout and walked to the western fire bay and stood there for a while and looked at the enemy's trench line, which was visible only as a smudge of displaced earth and a few flickers of movement in the gray light. And I thought about the word untenable and the word held and the difference between them, which is the width of a bolt round and the distance between a living man and a dead one. Pareth died on day 215. A mortar round hit the communication trench 12 meters from his dugout, and he was in the communication trench at the time, the first time in weeks. His coat was buttoned. His sidearm was clean. He was moving south toward the reserve line at a pace that suggested a destination. And he had not told me he was leaving, and he had not told anyone else, and his table was cleared of everything except one sheet of paper that I found afterwards, face down, blank. A man does not clear his table and put on his coat and button it and clean his sidearm and walk south for no reason. I will not tell you what I think he was doing. I think you can hear it already. What I think does not change what happened, and what happened is that the mortar round did not care about his reasons or mine, and the list in his pocket was destroyed with him. 506 names that he had carried against his skin exist nowhere now except in whatever machine the Munitorum uses to record the dead, where they are entries in a column rather than a list kept warm by a man's chest. Lieutenant Carnhall assumed command. She lasted 11 days, which was 10 more than I expected, and 1 fewer than she deserved. She was killed leading the defense of the elbow during the assault on day 226, which was the heaviest attack the enemy had launched since the start of the campaign. 3 waves over 4 hours with armored support that nobody had warned us about because nobody had known it was there. The half-smile died with her, and I do not know who mourned it more, her soldiers or the enemy sniper who had been trying to put a round through that smile for 3 months and was robbed of the opportunity by a battle cannon. I assumed command. This is not how it is supposed to work. A commissar is not in the chain of command. A commissar advises, endorses, motivates, and executes. A commissar does not issue deployment orders or manage logistics or coordinate fire plans. But there was nobody left. The 44th's officer cadre was Carnhall, who was dead, and 2 lieutenants, one of whom was wounded, and the other of whom had stopped speaking after the assault and stared at the wall of his dugout with the fixed concentration of a man who is watching something nobody else can see. And I had him removed from duty and did not shoot him. He had not failed the Emperor's trust. He had been broken by it, and I knew the difference even then. He went where all of them went, which was nowhere. He sat in his dugout and was fed twice a day by a trooper who had appointed himself to the job without being asked and without ever being told to stop. I reported the assumption of command in my next strength return, in the box provided in 1 line, as the regulation requires. Nothing came back. Nothing was ever going to come back. A commissar taking field command of a line regiment is the sort of irregularity that generates an inquiry, a review board, and in the wrong circumstances, a firing squad. And none of those things happened, and I know exactly why. The return that carried the irregularity also carried the sector status, and the sector status said held. The commissariat runs the same arithmetic as everybody else. You do not open a file on the man producing the only good column on the page. You wait to see how long he can keep producing it, and if he stops, the file opens itself. Gosgrin should have had the command. He was the better choice. He knew the trench, he knew the men. He had the respect that comes from competence rather than fear, which is a more durable material. But Gosgrin was a sergeant, and the regulation passes command to the senior commissar when no officer of sufficient rank remains, and the regulation does not care about competence. On day 226, with 158 men left in a trench built for 600 and the line collapsing east and west, it was the only structure left standing. 158 men, 58 mornings left at 1 per day, if nobody else died. That is not a thought a commissar is supposed to have, because a commissar does not count the living, he counts the infractions. And the infractions are addressed one at a time, and the supply of men is someone else's problem. But I was now both the commissar and the someone else, and the two perspectives did not fit inside the same skull comfortably, and I resolved the discomfort by not thinking about it, which is the commissar's answer to any problem a bolt round will not close. The winter deepened. The cold on Trevannoch in deep winter is not a temperature. It is a force. It gets into the trench like water, fills every space, and waits for you to stop moving. It took 3 fingers off Stanfell's right hand in the second week of it, which is what the cold does to a man whose work will not let him keep his hands inside anything. The boots had saved feet. Nobody had thought to send gloves, and I had not thought to ask for them, and I had written every other line on that form. He went on running the aid station because there was nobody else to run it, doing with 1.5 hands what he had previously done badly with 2, and swearing at a slightly lower volume, which was the only concession he made. The exemption I had granted him was granted for his hands. His hands were gone. I did not withdraw it. We lost men to it every night. Not many. 1 here, 2 there, enough. The dead went into the collapsed dugouts on the second line, because you cannot dig in ground that has gone to stone, and the Munitorum's disposal schedule assumes a spade. We laid them in and brought the roofs down over them, and by midwinter there was more of the 44th on the second line than there was standing on the first. The frost went thick enough on the parapet to blind the firing slits, so the men chipped it away every 2 hours. The chipping made noise, the noise drew sniper fire, and the sniper fire killed 2 men in 3 days. I spent that week weighing visibility against the men who would die providing it, which is a calculation a commissar never makes, and a commanding officer makes daily. The line held. It did not know that the man holding it had stopped being sure what he was. Day 270. 91 men. I had shot 78 since my arrival. The enemy had killed the rest, along with the cold and the shells, and the disease and the despair, and the 1,000 small failures that accumulate in a trench, the way water accumulates in a cellar. Silently, steadily, until one morning you look down and your boots are wet, and you cannot remember when the floor was dry. The symbols were everywhere, on the duckboards, on the shoring, on the parapet, on the backs of ammunition crates. Gosgrin had stopped reporting them because reporting them had never produced a result, and because Gosgrin did not report a thing twice. I had stopped looking for them. The men carving them were dying at the same rate as the men who were not. The marks had produced no operational effect I could name, and a commissar leaves theology to the ecclesiarchy. There was no ecclesiarchy on this part of the front. The confessor assigned to the 44th had died on day 14 and had never been replaced. Confessors on Trevannoch having a life expectancy that made even the Munitorum reluctant to spend one. Gosgren came to me on day 283. He had been on patrol in the forward sap, a tunnel running 20 meters toward the enemy lines, dug by men now dead for a purpose nobody remembered, and serving as a listening post where you could hear the enemies digging and moving, and sometimes talking if the wind was right. He said, "Commissar, they are pulling back." "Who?" I said. "Them." The forward positions were empty. He had gone out to the wire and looked, and the trenches opposite were abandoned, and the fire positions cold, and the equipment was still there, and the men were not. I went to see for myself, because what another man saw is not what he understood. I went to the forward sap, and I listened, and I heard nothing, which on Trevannoch was the most alarming sound available, because the enemy's trench was never silent. There was always movement, always the sound of men doing the things that men do when they are holding a position. Coughing, scraping, hammering, swearing, the low murmur of people existing. The silence was total. Gosgren was right, they were gone. Not retreating, not redeploying, not maneuvering. Gone. The positions that had held 1,000 soldiers or more for the better part of a year were empty. The wire was still up. The weapon pits were still dug. The trench stores were still stacked where the stores go. But the mortar pits were empty, and the Vox masts were down and carried off, rather than cut, and what tracks the frost had kept ran east and west along the back of their line instead of north away from it. A force that takes its tubes and its signals and leaves its trench stock has not been driven off anywhere. They had taken everything a moving unit needs and left everything a stationary one does. And they had not gone in a night. They had thinned out over a week in shifts at the hours our sentries changed. Nobody in my trench heard them because we were listening for an enemy coming toward us, and the sound of one leaving is a sound no sentry is trained to hear. Gosgren went across. I told him not to, and he went anyway, which was the first time he had disobeyed me, and I let it stand. Not out of sentiment. The offense in disobedience is the witnessing, and there were 9 men in that section who had heard the order and watched him step over the parapet. So by the regulation, it was already an execution. But the regulation assumes the regiment has another sergeant. I did that arithmetic while he was crossing the open ground, and I kept the sergeant. And it is the only occasion on Trevannoch when I read the regulation and put it back down. He was gone for 40 minutes. When he came back, his face was the color of the trench wall, and his hands were steady in the way that a man's hands are steady when the thing they are carrying is too heavy to shake. He had found the marks, the same circles, the same lines, carved into the enemy's side of the shoring, in rows, organized, and next to each mark, scratched in small careful letters, a name, imperial names, our names, Poliver names, and Nembrist names, and Ilsmore names, and names from units I did not recognize, dozens of them, with dates beside them. A list, a recruitment ledger scratched into wood the way a quartermaster scratches inventory into a stockroom wall. You do not keep a list like that on paper. Paper comes off a body and gets read back to the man who wrote it. A wall cannot be carried anywhere and cannot be taken off anybody, and the men cutting those marks were not in intelligence service. They were line soldiers running night patrols, and line soldiers keep their score where they work. These were the men who had been contacted during the night raids, the probes, the quiet approaches in the dark. These were the men who had listened. These were the men who had carved the marks in our trench to signal that they were ready to walk across when the word came. Gosgrin said, "Most of these names are men you shot." He had known, not the ledger, not the names, but the shape of it, that the dangerous thing in Sector 9 was standing inside the wire and not beyond it. He had known since day 80. He had carried a knife on his belt every day since and slept with his back to the wall for 200 nights. And he had brought it to me once, and I had told him it was unit markings, and he had never raised it again. I had spent 200 days being the most dangerous thing in that trench, and he had spent them being the only man who was right about what the trench contained. I looked at the list. He was right. I recognized them. The man with the enemy rations, the man with the symbols on his last gun stock, the man who had been talking to himself at the wire, who I had killed for being close to doing something wrong, and who had in fact been doing something much worse than I had imagined. The two deserters from the first month, the ones who had made it across, their names were on the list too, with a mark beside them that looked different from the others, completed. And the two from day 120. The two who had scraped the marks off their sleeves overnight and stood in the assembly the next morning with clean cuffs and correct posture, and whom I had let live because the marks were gone, and the regulation requires a visible infraction. Both names were on that wall. Both carried the completed mark. Both dates fell inside the week following the morning I decided the regulation had been satisfied. I had not shown them mercy. I had processed them incorrectly, and the enemy had collected the difference. The enemy had been building a roster, man by man, night by night, name by name, and I had been destroying it. Every morning I stood in the mud and shot one man, and on some of those mornings the man I shot was a name on that list, and the enemy crossed him off and started again with the next. That was what Carnhall had seen. That was what they were measuring. Not our tactical response, not our deployment patterns. Our loyalty, man by man, name by name, and the rate at which I destroyed their work. They had been studying me the way you study a machine that keeps breaking your tools, and they had concluded, correctly, that they could not recruit faster than I could execute. So they had done the other thing. They had waited for my siphon to drain the sectors on either side, and they had broken through there instead, where the commissars were less efficient, and the recruitment lists were longer, and the men walked across in the night without anyone to stop them. They did not need to beat me. They needed to wait for me to beat everything else. And it answered a question I had filed and stopped opening. 2 marksmen had tried for me inside my first 100 days, and none had tried since. And no mortar had walked across that assembly ground after day 39 either, and neither of those was because anybody had failed. Somebody on the far side of that wire had been handed the same arithmetic Parith showed me on a Munitorum assessment sheet, and had run it earlier, and had reached the end of it. A commissar who holds his sector draws the best men on the line into it and spends them. Kill him, and the Munitorum posts a replacement, and the replacement might be ordinary. And an ordinary commissar in Sector 9 means the good soldiers get routed somewhere they might live. I was the most productive instrument the enemy had on the Culwer Line. I was being fed, housed, and paid by the Munitorum. And the only people on Trevannoch who had assessed my value correctly were 300 meters to the north and had taken the trouble to leave me exactly where I was. The answer came 3 days later, and it did not come from the enemy. It came from the Munitorum. A dispatch runner arrived from the reserve line, which was an event rare enough to be notable, carrying a sealed document with a priority cipher that I had never seen before, and which took me 10 minutes to decode with the reference sheet that every commissar carries and hopes never to use. The document was one page. It said that Sectors 7 and 8, to our east, had been abandoned by Imperial forces following a breakthrough that had occurred 4 days prior. It said that Sectors 10, 11, and 12, to our west, had been abandoned by Imperial forces following a breakthrough that had occurred 3 days prior. It said that the Culwer Line was no longer a continuous defensive position, and that remaining formations were to consolidate at Rally Point Ohrenfeld, 40 kilometers to the south, at the earliest opportunity. At the earliest opportunity. That was the phrase. Not immediately, not with all haste. At the earliest opportunity, which is the Munitorum's way of saying whenever you can manage it without anybody having to come and get you. Nobody was coming. The resources that might have come had been sent to me over the past 11 months and spent. Ohrenfeld was 40 kilometers south, across open ground in deep winter, and we were wished luck in a way that did not require anybody to provide any. The enemy had not left because they were redeploying. They had left because there was nobody on either side of me anymore. They had broken through to the east and to the west, and my sector was an island, a held position with open flanks and nothing behind it and nothing beside it. And the enemy did not need to break through here because they had already gone around. And a position that has been bypassed is not a position. It is a monument to a decision that somebody should have changed, and nobody did. 91 men, 40 kilometers of open ground, deep winter, no transport, no armor, no air cover, no supply between here and a rally point that might or might not still be in Imperial hands by the time we arrived. I assembled the men, what was left of them. 91 faces in the cold, breath steaming, eyes that had seen everything the Culwer Line had to show them and were now being asked to see something new, which was the possibility that the line they had held for 286 days did not matter anymore and might never have mattered, and that the morning's bolt round and the afternoon's bombardment and the evening's burial detail had all been the components of a machine that had now been switched off by someone who had never seen it running. I told them. I read the dispatch. I told them we were ordered to consolidate at Ohrenfeld. I told them the march was 40 kilometers. I told them we would move that night. 91 included the men who could not walk. They had been carried on the roll as effective for months because the form has no other column, and the form was now going to be tested against 40 kilometers of open ground. I brought them out. That was not mercy. A position I have abandoned is a position with nobody on it, and a man left in one has been put somewhere rather than lost, and I would have had to write down which. The trooper who fed the silent lieutenant took him by the sleeve and walked him out with the rest, and the lieutenant went where he was led and made no trouble about any of it. I knew what the road would do to them. I gave the order anyway. The choice was never whether. It was where. And then I did the morning's work. There was a man. There is always a man. This one had been found with enemy rations in his kit. The trench opposite was empty now, so he had been across it before it emptied. A man who crosses the line has stopped being a soldier and started being a corridor, and corridors let things through in both directions. I shot him. 90 men. The line held. We did not reach Ohrenfeld. The march was 40 kilometers through terrain that had been Imperial 6 days earlier and was now nobody's, which is worse than enemy held. Nobody's ground has no rules and no expectation of what happens next. We crossed the reserve line at 2300 hours, and nobody challenged us because there was nobody on it. The dugouts were open, the fire positions were clear. and the standing water in the bottom of the trench had frozen unbroken across its whole width, which takes about 4 nights and tells you more about a position than any report will. Whoever had held the reserve line had gone before the dispatch reached me, and the dispatch had reached me first because I was the only sector still filing. I filed a movement report with nobody, addressed to nobody, stamped it with nobody's authority, and put it in my pocket. The regulation requires a movement report. We moved south through the communication network and into the open ground that connected the Culwer Line to its rear, and the open ground was frozen and flat, and the wind came off the northern ridgeline like something with intentions. We passed through what had been Sector 7. The trench was empty, abandoned, the wire still up, the dugouts still roofed, the fire bays still stacked with ammunition that nobody had taken and nobody had destroyed. The marks were on the walls. Dozens of them, circles and lines scratched into the shoring, and I stopped looking after the first 50 meters. Among the abandoned kit, I found a Munitorum assessment sheet, the same kind of form Parith had shown me, creased and muddy and stepped on, lying on a dugout floor next to a bedroll still holding the shape of the man who had slept in it. Sector 7's replacement utilization rate was less than a third of ours. Their days held per casualty ratio was half. The good soldiers that should have come here had come to me instead, and the men who had held this trench had held it with what was left, and they had held it as long as they could, and then they had broken and the trench was empty, and I was walking through the result. I put the assessment on the table where I had found it. A man carrying evidence of his own efficiency is a man who has started to see his efficiency for what it was, and I was not ready for that, and I would never be ready for that. And we moved on. 31 men were lost to enemy action during the movement, primarily from long-range fire and 2 ambushes in terrain that had been enemy-held for less than a week, and was still being organized, which is the only reason we survived them. An organized enemy would have killed every one of us in the first 5 minutes. And the disorganized enemy that engaged us was still arguing about deployment when Goskren flanked them with 15 men and a heavy bolter that jammed every 36 rounds and was cleared with a kick. 22 men were lost to exposure, and most of them were the ones who had been walked out rather than marched. This is the polite number. The actual number is that 22 men stopped walking and did not start again, and we left them where they stopped because we could not carry them, and we could not wait for them, and we could not bury them in frozen ground with no tools. And they are still there, I assume, in a line that stretches south from Sector 9 like a trail of breadcrumbs left by a fairy tale for children who are not coming. Stanfell was the 9th of them. He had been carrying a satchel of boiled cloth and nothing else worth carrying, and he stopped in the 2nd hour before dawn and sat down in the manner of a man taking a short rest, and when I came back down the column, he was where I had left him and had been for some time. I took the satchel. Somebody had to have it, and I was the one standing there. I did not take the ring off his left hand. Personal effects go rearward against a form. The form goes to the Munitorum, and there was no longer a Munitorum in any direction I could walk. A ring in a commissar's pocket with no form attached is not in effect. It is theft, and I have shot men for less. So it is still out there on a hand, under whatever the snow did afterwards. He turned it with his thumb when he was thinking, which was always. I never once asked him what it was. Goskren died at the 2nd ambush. He took a round through the throat while directing fire from behind a rock that was not large enough to cover him and that he had chosen anyway, because it was the best position available, and Goskren always chose the best position available, And the best position available was not always survivable, and this one was not. He did not say anything. He put his hand on his neck and he sat down, and he looked at me, and his look was settled. It was the look of a man who is performing a final calculation and wants to make sure the numbers are correct before he signs off on them. Then he stopped looking at anything, and I picked up the heavy bolter myself, and I kicked it, and it fired, and we moved on. 90 men left Sector 9. 37 reached the edge of the Culwer Line's rearward operational zone, which is where the trench system ended and the open ground began. 23 of those survived the march across the open ground. 14 of those survived the ambushes. I arrived at Rally Point Ohrenfeld with 14 men on day 294 of the Trevannoch campaign year, and Rally Point Ohrenfeld was a field depot with a munitorum clerk and a stack of forms, and no fortifications and no reinforcements, and no plan for what to do with the fragments of a line that had broken everywhere except the one place it should have broken first. The clerk processed us. He checked our regimental designation and looked at his list. The Culwer 44th. I said we are what is left of the Culwer 44th. The sector was listed as held, he told me, with a note of surprise that I found so perfectly representative of the Munitorum's relationship with reality that I nearly laughed, and I did not laugh. And what came next removed any possibility of humor from the conversation. There were no orders for our consolidation. The sector was still marked as active in the system. The dispatch authorizing withdrawal had been sent to all Culwer Line formations, but held sectors were classified as discretionary withdrawal. The Commissar's assessment was required before the order could be executed. I said, "I am the Commissar. I withdrew us." "Yes, Commissar, but the assessment was not filed. The regulation requires the Commissar's untenable assessment before withdrawal is authorized, and my last assessment, filed on day 285, stated that the position was held. I had filed that assessment the morning before the dispatch arrived. Position held. Because it was held. Because I was holding it. Because 91 men were standing in a trench, and the trench was intact, and the enemy had not taken it, and the regulation asks about now, not about tomorrow, and now the line was held. And now the line did not exist, and I was standing in a field depot with 14 men and a clerk, explaining with the gentle patience of a man trained to deliver bad news as though it were weather, that my sector was still active in the system. A held sector requires a garrison. The garrison was me and my 14 men. The regulation sets no minimum, and as long as somebody is filed against a sector, the sector exists. I gave him the movement report as well, the one I had written to nobody at 2300 hours on a reserve line with nobody on it. He read it through twice. There was no field on his form for a movement conducted without authorization out of a position that was still shown as held. So he wrote the date in the margin and put it in the stack, which is the most honest thing anybody did to a sheet of paper in the whole of that year. I thought about Parith. I thought about his hands shaking under the table. I thought about him asking me to write a word on a piece of paper and me saying no because the word would be a lie. The word would have been the truth. Not then, but now. And the difference between then and now was 76 men dead on a march through the snow, and a sergeant with his hand on his throat looking at me with the expression of a man checking his numbers. And the numbers were correct, and the answer was 0. I filed the assessment. Position untenable. I wrote it on the form the clerk handed me, and I signed it with my name and my rank and my commissariat serial number, and the clerk stamped it and filed it, and the sector ceased to exist. I have set all of this down in the format the Munitorum requires. Establishment against holding, every line on the form filled in, Nothing omitted and nothing rounded. It is the last strength return for Sector 9, Culwer Line. It is also the only return I have ever written that is complete, and I have written it in the full knowledge that nobody will read it, because I know what becomes of a return filed against a sector that no longer exists. It goes into the same machine as every other return, and the machine holds no procedure for a position that has ceased. That is why this one can say what it says. A correct return is not a confession once the office it reports to has closed, and every office that could have done anything about any of this closed on the afternoon I signed the word untenable. Then we were reassigned, the 14 of us. Not as the Culwer 44th, which no longer existed as a designation, but as individual replacements, distributed to other sectors on other lines on other parts of Trevannoch, where the war was still happening and would continue to happen for however long the Munitorum decided it should happen. 14 men scattered into the machine like rounds into a magazine, each chambered separately, each fired separately, each expended on a line that would hold until it did not, and then be replaced by another. That is how wars on Trevannoch end. Not with victory or defeat, but with a shortage of everything, including the will to count what has been lost. I was reassigned too, not to a sector, to a regiment, a new regiment, newly raised, newly shipped, newly arrived on Trevannoch, full of men who had never seen a trench and had never heard a mortar, and had never watched the man next to them die in the particular way that men die on Trevannoch, which is without ceremony and without warning, and without any of the significance that the word death is supposed to carry. I reported to my new posting on day 342 of the Trevannoch campaign year. The regiment was the Ostelhaven 19th. They were at full strength. They were clean. Their uniforms fit, their weapons worked, their officers were alive, and their NCOs were competent, and their men were frightened in the healthy way that men are frightened when they have not yet learned that fear is an insufficient response to what is coming. The Munitorum had never run out of men. I had been wrong about that for months. It had run out of men allocated to the Culwer Line, which is a different sentence and an older one. Somewhere a long way south of anything I could see before the breakthrough, and I would guess before the winter, a decision had been taken about where the next intake was going, and it was not going to a front that had already been written down. The Ostelhaven 19th were aboard a ship while I was rationing 13 days of convoy and spending runners to keep a curve legible. They were not late. They were simply never ours. I stood in front of them on the morning of day 343. The winter was deep and the frost was on my coat and my bolt pistol was loaded and the parade ground was mud, which is the universal surface of the Imperial Guard. The thing that connects every regiment on every world in every war the Imperium has ever fought. I looked at them. They looked at me. 600 men who had never lost one. And I said the thing I had said 342 days earlier on a landing pad to a different set of faces in a different sector on a different part of a line that no longer existed. I am Commissar Jennek Hult. Every morning I will stand in this spot. Every morning one of you will stand in front of me. The winter had 3 weeks left. By the time it was done, I would be the only one still holding the line. I always am.